What group of real men have their highest aspirations as that involving being employed by the men of another ethnic group? It is an amazing situation that black men have seen themselves as the permanent second bananas of white men who are getting angry. You hear a book out here now talking about the anger of the successful Negroes. You know, you should be angry. You should be angry with yourself. You are angry because the white boys are not letting you in. What a shame. Why aren't you creating your own industry? But let's look again at the NAFTA. Where were the Afro-Caribbean nations in that agreement? Where was the Africa? Where were the African nations during that agreement? Let's look at the GATT agreement. Where does Africa fit in those agreements? What you have going on here, ladies and gentlemen, is almost a total isolation of African people across the whole diaspora. You have a NAFTA agreement which is essentially a club between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And the members of this club are giving each other special privileges. Privileges that will be denied other people who are not members of the club. They will get special discounts, access to special markets, special protections, special financing, and other kinds of things because they are members of the NAFTA club. And yet we see no African nations and no people who are part of that. You talk about trading with Africa. You talk about trading with the Caribbean nations. What is going to happen when you decide to trade with the Caribbean nations and trade with the African nations and find out that you cannot enter into the kind of trade you want to because the methods you have chosen to trade run against the NAFTA agreement? That the United States has agreed with the Mexicans or agreed with the Canadians that certain products outside of their club cannot be imported into the country. Or that products that are imported into the country must be taxed in some special sort of way. And yet you're a part of the so-called nation. You talk about trade. You talk about exporting materials to Africa. Well, what if the materials or the services you plan to export to Africa run up again against NAFTA agreements? This is what we're talking about here, ladies and gentlemen. Serious issues. It is time for African American people to get over our ignorance. You've got to read more than books written by black folk because the books are not covering enough territory. You cannot let yourself be deceived by people who tell you simply because books are written by white folk, you should not read them. White folk don't write every book to deceive black folk. They don't write every book with you in mind. Why do black people have problems reading? Because they're not taught well in school? Not really. The problems black people have with reading has nothing to do with academia. What are we saying here? The problem that we have with reading as a people is a political problem that expresses itself in school as an academic problem. What do I mean by that? I mean by that there is so much information in America. Real information, factual information, information everywhere you look, free-flowing information. So in order for us to be ignorant, we have to will ourselves to be ignorant. In a sense, we must be dumb in America in order not to take advantage of the information available to us. In other words, there is so much information available that if we truly could read as a people, and I'm not talking about technical reading, there are those who have great vocabularies who still can't read. We truly must not be interested in reading in order for this information to flow around us the way it does. In other words, we have to fall asleep over our books. We have to get headaches when we read. We have to lack interest in reading. We have to, if we are men, see reading as a feminine activity, as something that we are not supposed to do, as something that's exclusively the right of white boys. In other words, these kinds of attitudes must be psychologically and politically induced in the black mind so that whites can enjoy freedom of speech and lay out every means, line by line and chapter by chapter, of how they rule African people and maintain us in subordination. This is what it's about, and it's here, and it's available for us. And yet we are not availing ourselves to the information. We are entering into an age now where the wars are not the wars so much which involve military might, but what we call econo-wars. Wars of economy, where nations will be defeated and destroyed as effectively by their economic positions and struggles as they used to be defeated in terms of military struggles. Ronald Reagan and the white conservatives made up their minds years ago that they would destroy Russia not in terms of dropping bombs on Russia, but that they would spin Russia into the ground. And what they would do would keep escalating the cost of weapons and keep escalating military budgets. And as the Russians sought to keep up with them in military spending, ultimately Russia would collapse economically. And that is exactly what happened, and the Russian Empire fell apart. And today Clinton is in Russia getting ready to feed on that nation like vultures. And the Eastern Europeans who were a part of the so-called Warsaw Pact now want to join NATO. Why? Because of the wars of economics. And these nations are now teaming up to make war against African nations and African people. We can talk then about the regional agreement between Asian nations, and African nations are not a part of those agreements. We can talk about the regional agreements in Latin America. They are now setting up Chile, and they're now setting up Argentina to be the next members of the NAFTA Accords. In other words, ultimately the United States will wrap in the whole of Central and South America into the NAFTA club, along with Canada. Where are the Caribbean Africans in this situation? In other words, then, we see Europe creating a community of nations. And we see ultimately Europe uniting with Eastern Europe and the other parts of Europe. We will ultimately see Islamic nations creating economic blocks. And where then are the African blocks, and where is the Pan-African economic system? We got Negroes over here singing "We Shall Overcome" and talking about they're a part of some multicultural society and talking about diversity in the workplace. Getting over ethnicity when the whole world is combining in terms of ethnicity. But this is the game. This is the game we've fallen for century after century. People talking one thing and doing another. And now we see that the African Americans are being isolated in this very nation. We are now more segregated in this nation than we were in the 1920s.